Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
Hello students, I, Assistant Professor Mayur Thakur from the Department of English, School of Humanities and Social Sciences welcomes you all in the video lecture series of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University, Ahmedabad. In the last lecture, we have discussed A Passage to India, which is a British novel which was very famous during the modern period. In today's session, we are going to start the British novel as it emerges and how it works under the age of Augustus Caesars, which was very popularly also known as Augustan age, and also we known as it a Alexander Pope. So in today's session we are going to discuss following things: historical background of the age. So now let us discuss the historical background. English literature has produced some of the richest treasures of the literary world not until 18th century. However, a type of literature developed that completely proved the traditions of the past and opened the door, a complete new door, to a whole new generation of writers which were very famous during the Augustan period. Just like writers and also the kind of new genres that happened in the 18th century. If we see 18th century, earlier there was a drama, but in 18th century, English novel changed completely, and we can say the very first novel was published in the 18th century literature. English novel helped to change the literary landscape of forever. The works within the genre, they were so diverse that many different types of authors and variably writing, a kind of writing which was not known, and earlier it was not very much, we can say, famous. According to their own styles and preferences were changed. Now, during the development, the literal development of English novel, which was changed completely, not only in England but throughout the Europe. In 18th century, what actually happens that after the restoration of the Charles II in the 17th century, and later on there was a rule of James I, who was a very last Catholic king of England, and later on there William of Orange and her queen, they ruled the England, and later on there was a era of Queen Anne. They were very famous rulers of England. But in the 18th century, what actually happened, there was very drama which was very much famous in the Renaissance period and the Restoration period. Earlier, now it took place changes because of some historical and political changes. It was a product, we can say, the product of environment. At the time it was born with the 18th century and died with it the novel on the other hand. The drama was survived not valiantly to the turn of the century. It was immediately after 1740 that the English novel suddenly changed. In this series, or we can say the session, the literary characters of the Augustan age, emergence of novel as a literary genre, four wheels of English novels, and the love, we'll discuss the historical and the background that happened in the 18th century. The background of the period is very much full of kings and queens, those who used to rule England before in the Restoration. Now it is completely changed. What happened in the 18th century, that after the Queen Anne, the Hanoverian dynasty came into power. The social environment, the rise of the middle class, the democratic movement, the ascendancy of realism, merger of the Great Britain, and Hanoverian dynasty, which came into power for the 5 kings. Now, if you look at the beginning of the 18th century England, what actually happened, that the social era, and we can say the social environment was completely changing. Coffee houses, chocolate bars were starting, the clubs, the literary clubs also started. There are many things that happened in the the literary development. The social environment. The social environment was very much quite new because there was a sudden rise of urban middle class in the England. The democratic movement, we can say, the Tories and the Whigs. Those were the two political party during the 18th century. The Tories were in the support of the divine right of ruling the land by the king, where the Whigs were very much in support of the democracy. The ascendancy of realism. It was a very much real. The kind of literature was started by the periodical essayist Joseph Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. Later on, it was continued by the Samuel Johnson, and then we have the period of transition, which is also known as period of transition, when the very first dictionary by Dr. Samuel Johnson, which was published in the 1755. And the next, we have the Romantic period. So 18th century can be divided into three parts. We can say the first was Romantic, the second is transition, the third can be the Augustan period. And now, why it is called the Augustan age? Because of the Augustus Caesar. In Roman, we can say during it was named after the Roman literature that happened in the 5th century BC in the Rome, and it is named after the period that Augustus Caesar. And it is also known as Neoclassical period. In Neoclassical period, there was an era of it was a very prominent era of especially the satire and the mock epics, which was the famous writer by the Alexander Pope, Daniel Defoe, Richard Steele, Joseph Addison, periodical essayist, and the novelist that contributed into English literature. Now let's look at the merger of the Great Britain. It was the period in 1707, Scotland, England, Wales, and the Northern Ireland, they got merged into the Great Britain. The ascendancy of realism can be seen in every genre of the literature, and the middle classes who were working in various trades, they were also started in getting interested in the political affairs. And now let's look at the literary characteristics of the 18th century. There were more freedom given to novelists rather than dramatists. Rise of the periodical essays, rise of the novels, leisure, circulating libraries, rise of the common people, decline of drama due to Licensing Act 1777, and these are the four wheels of English novels. As we have discussed, that there was a rise of the novels due to the foundation of 18th century English novel in the 1714. There was a very first novel by Samuel Johnson titled as Pamela, and after there was a Henry Fielding. Then comes the Lawrence Stearns and the Tobias Smollett. So these were the four, we can say, the major pillars of English novels. English novels, why it becomes very popular? The reason was very quite clear. It was because of the decline of drama due to Licensing Act 1770. One of the major pillar of English novels, that is Henry Fielding, who was earlier used to work as a jurist, and he also started his career as a dramatist, but later on, due to the decline of drama, he also started working as a novelist. Now, if you look at the periodical essays, it was an era of periodical essays. There were a Spectator, Tatler, and also there was one periodical essay run by Dr. Samuel Johnson. It was known as The Rambler. So these were very famous periodical essayists. The time of leisure can be seen because due to growing urban middle class, especially the females who used to work at home, they found very much time of reading, and people try to establish themselves as we can say a growing class of society. So they have very much time to read. So during that period of time, there was circulating libraries throughout the country. People used to started reading and explored many new genres of writing. Also, there were many, as we have discussed earlier, there were political parties, those who were engaged in the day-to-day routines of people's lives. People discuss, people go, people hang out, and they meet at one place and to just discuss the day-to-day routines and what is going on in the country. So that was the reason behind establishment of the coffee houses and the clubs and everything that happened in the 18th century. There were so many literary clubs, and the writers were discussing all that in these works, especially the form of satire. Literary genre is satire, which we know as a kind of a quality which describes people's folly or vices into a very humorous way. And there was one of the very famous author, that is Daniel Defoe, was Gulliver's Travels, which was published in 1724, was the very major work of that period. Just like Henry Fielding's, the very first work was Joseph Andrews, and later on, he Tom Jones, which we are going to discuss in the second part of this lecture, which will be discussed in detail. Now, the 18th century was imbued with the spirit of realism, the man of letters. In 18th century, whether he was a poet, a periodical essayist, or even a dramatist, believed that for the success of his art, rational appraisal, means the logic and reason, were essential, which is a very prerequisite condition. The novel was another important thing in terms of, we can say, the instrument for the exploration and representation of social reality, which is depicted in various formats by many authors. And all the novelists of the 18th century and most of the followers, the subsequent centuries, were stark real. The social critics. So as we can see on the screen, that these are the very major for English novelists, and the social critics and the middle class minds as this picture real because it has form, a hold upon reality and cannot break itself away. The people started taking interest in the novel because of these four authors. The realism came to find its most favorable fields in the novel, the social realism. Now, if we look at why drama was declined, the decline of drama, it is only because of some facts that affect the writings of the people. The decline of drama also contributed to the rise of the novel. And in the 18th century, what actually happened, that no longer social force as it had been the age of Elizabeth, or as it is also known as Renaissance, or even that of Charles II, or the Licensing Act of 1737, which was meant to curb such scurrilous. Means the Licensing Act was basically a kind of a censorship. Right now in India we have a censor board which cut and edit the unnecessary parts of a particular video or a movie or any scene which is very, we can say, not good for a social harmony. So just like that, in England, that at that point of time, there was a Licensing Act of 1737 which curbs the freedom of drama. As we all know, that drama was a very famous form of literature during the Renaissance. But in the 18th century, the novel gets its place because of the Licensing Act. Now, it is also known as the age of logic and reason. The form, the style, the manner, these were the major parts of the 18th century English literature. Or we can say the age of Pope, because it was named after the Alexander Pope. The Alexander Pope has written so many books: the Essay on Men, the Essay on Criticism, one of his major mock epic, that is the Rape of the Lock. And all these works were very famous. It is only because that Pope has comment on the social realities of his times. And then after, there were many critics who contributed in that particular genre. The literary criticism as well as the literary genre of novel was developing side by side. After Pope, there was a Dr. Samuel Johnson, who contributed in terms of letters, are popularly known as the man of English letters, who first published his very first dictionary in English. Or we can say the very first dictionary was published during this 18th century literature in 1755. Another thing that happened in 18th century was more freedom of novelists rather than dramatists. Novelists were very free to discuss their problems through writing the book, we can see, which is almost 200 to 300 pages nowadays. And also it is nowadays, if we see, the novel is one of the most popular forms in English literature. So from 18th century to present day, novel has its importance because it has plots, characters, themes, characters of different kind of genres, and also it has types of fiction. We have historical fiction, social fiction, science fiction. So these kind of genres were developed age-wise. In every age, you will see the different kind of fiction started. In 18th century, we can say the social, or we can say the satirical fiction were started. Just like one of the biggest example of satirical fiction is 1728 novel written by Daniel Defoe, which is popularly called the Gulliver's Travels. Defoe's definites at the art of the narrative his gift of circumstantial detail and his unflinching realism of the society and the examination of low life helped him to describe and to develop him as a novelist. He has written many other prose works, or we can say the prose writings were also developing during this period. Catholics were not that much in power, and more of a logical and reasoning were going on in the 18th century. Circulating libraries and the rise of common people, as we can say, the power which was given by the various acts passed throughout the period, helped them to develop themselves, helped them people to develop their own identity. People were started getting more and more interested in literature. It is only because due to their reading habits and the leisure they got. Now let us go back to the historical characteristics. In historical characteristics, as we have discussed earlier, the democracy, the Robert Hugh Walpole, the first Prime Minister of the Britain, took oath in 1730s. From 1750, we can say the Industrial Revolution also started in the England. People started moving from rural to urban places. In 18th century, all kinds of things politically and historically were changing. A kind of shift happened, and that's why after the death of Alexander Pope from 1745, the new era started, which is known as the Age of Transition. In Age of Transition, or we can say the period in which the pre-Romanticism also developed. The pre-Romantic writers like William Blake, who has written so many poems on the problems that happened due to industrialization. Oliver Goldsmith. We have many authors. We have many authors like Samuel Johnson, Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, which was a very famous work of Daniel Defoe, which describes the people, a kind of, we can say, the colonized people who were living during that period. Because at that point of time, the development of European colonization were growing all around the world, and especially the British imperialism has increased its boundaries from England to the east. All these things were responsible because history repeats itself, and all these things repeats in the Victorian period. Because in the Victorian period, after in the 19th century, the industrial revolutions were on the peak, and also the colonization were increased, and almost everything was very clear to the people. In the literary characteristics, we see the rise of periodical essays played a very major role. We can say that in the first novel started developing only because of the periodical essays. Periodical essays written by Richard Steele and Joseph Atherton, which was probably twice in a week, every Tuesday and Thursday, and they tried a kind of pamphlets, in a very small manner, which is very famous, known as Coverley papers. So Coverley papers also help people to know about the kind of things and characteristics. The characters described in the periodical essays were representing actually the reality of their society. One of the very famous works, which is called Coverley papers, it is only because it describes the reality and political characteristics of the society. Now the next one is another very important author of 18th century, that is Samuel Johnson. So Samuel Johnson also written many things, but before going back to that, there are four important novels. The four important novelists, which we, as we have discussed, that they were known as the four wheels of English novels, and they are Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson, Tobias Smollett, and Lawrence Sterne. So these very famous four writers has contributed themselves to the development of the novel. The very first novel, Pamela, which was based on a particular character called a female character, which was oppressed by her masters in the 1740s. And the next is Henry Fielding. Henry Fielding has written many novels. Earlier, as we have discussed, that he was a dramatist, but in the 18th century, he tried to develop his own writing style, and people also followed him. Just like first he wrote Joseph Andrews and then Tom Jones. So Tom Jones is a kind of a sequel to the novel earlier which he published called Joseph Andrews. And then comes the Tobias Smollett and the Lawrence Sterne. Lawrence Sterne has written a very wonderful work in 12 volumes, that is Tristram Shandy, The Adventures and His Lives. So it talks about a kind of autobiographical thing. So all these writers, especially the novelists, and apart from novels, there was a development in poetry. As we have seen that Alexander Pope has written many novels, and apart from his writings, he has nothing. He is not very much able to contribute to the novel writing, but he has written in terms of criticism and the poems, the mock epics. As for example, we have the Rape of the Lock, which was published in 1712, which talks about the people in terms of their living, their mannerism. As we have seen as we seen in the poem, that it talks about a kind of a game played by a upper class of the society, where the main character, which is Belinda, who goes to a club where people are sitting and playing the game of dice and the cards, the kind of cards where people are cards, and she lost her lock. So in that very, we can say, minute things, he observed and he write such a long poem on that, we can say, the minute incident. Another thing that happened, apart from Alexander Pope, there were major other literary critics who tried to develop their own writing styles. Lawrence Stans, we have the Oliver Goldsmith, who wrote very famous poem which talks about the industrialization that happened in the 18th century, called Deserted Village, which talks about the reality of industrial revolution during the 18th century. Apart from that, there were many other novelists and dramatists who contributed in the genre of various kinds of literature that happened in the 18th century. Once again, if we conclude that how was the literature progressed in the 18th century, we can say from history, politically, socially, and literally, and all four sections of the society, that people are trying to develop themselves as much as they want to, because 18th century has its own importance in terms of literature, in terms of drama, in terms of poetry. All four things of literature, or we can say the four genres, were developed very much. In this period, we can say the logic and reason get prominence. Earlier in Restoration, we have seen the licentiousness of the society and the reality were described by the monarchs. It was very much monarch centric. But in 18th century, what happened, that people started to develop in terms of political, social. They get rights, even especially the female authors. Female authors also started to develop. Just like we have Afra Ben, who wrote a very famous work called Orun Koku. So these are the kind of things that female authors also started, and about female were getting kind of aware about the rights, and the kind of wave that also started of feminism wave. We can say the very first wave also started during this period. In the end of 18th century, we have Mary Wollstonecraft, who published his very famous work, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Also, there was a very famous critic of a Restoration playwright called Jeremy Collier. So Jeremy Collier used to critique all these his previous dramatists because of their writing style. And the very famous thing that happened in the 18th century, that hack writing. Hack writing, we can say, the people started to write for money. As we can see in the perspective of 20th and 21st century, that anything can be written just for the sake of money. The person who belongs to a Whigs party or a Tory party, anything he can be write against, or a Whigs or a Tories. So that kind of thing happened also in the 18th century. People started to write anything just for the sake of money. There were also many hack writers in the 18th century. Another, if we look at the importance, that in terms of history, politically, socially, the 18th century developed not just the society, but as a nation. England emerges as a nation. In terms of not just literature, if we look at the science, we have Sir Isaac Newton, who gave us the law of gravity. And also many other scientists and scientific revolutions were started in England. And we can say the inventions and the rest of the imperial development was going on the continents like Asia, Africa. The Britain was we can say that at its peak, because it is developed. It was after the East India Company established during the 17th century. Now it emerges. Now it emerges as a kind of a ruling power. Earlier it was made for trade and commerce, but when 18th century started, now it becomes as a ruler. As we see in East India Company was established in India, but in 18th century it started not just trading, but also they started ruling and try to interfere in the political and administrative affairs of the country. So in today's session, we have discussed the historical and the literary characteristics of the Augustan age, which also known as neoclassical, which is also known as age of Pope. So these have 3 to 4 names which has given to this particular period, and also why it is called as neoclassics, because they try to form the classical authors in their particular writings, just like in the Rome and the Greeks were writing. So that is why it is called neoclassical. In other terms, people also calls it pseudo-classics, because they have just following just the styles and manners of that particular country, not the we can say the originality. Originality has nothing to do, because they were pseudo-classics. They were just following the forms and styles of a particular period, not the original. People were starting writing on anything, as we have discussed. There were hawk writers, so they just writing just anything for money. And there were so many literary clubs who developed during this period. So we can say it was an era of social change, political upliftment, a decline of drama, and the emergence of novel as one of the most popular form. In the next lecture, we will discuss one of the very famous novel of this period, that is Tom Jones, which is written by one of the major pillar of English novels called Henry Fielding. So in today's lecture, we have discussed all the major factors that happened in the 18th century literature. In the next session, we are going to discuss the Tom Jones. Thank you all for joining today's session. Thank you.